The blood-soaked bandana fluttered in the hot Arizona wind as Katherine Turner stumbled across the barren wasteland. Her cracked lips parted in silent prayer for salvation that seemed unlikely to arrive. It was July 1878, and the unforgiving desert sun of the territory beat down upon her blistered skin with merciless intensity. Her once fine dress, now torn and filthy, told the tale of a woman who had fallen far from the comfortable life she'd known back east. Katherine's thoughts drifted hazily between consciousness and delirium as she pushed forward, one agonizing step after another. 2 days prior, the stagecoach she'd been traveling in had been ambushed by bandits outside the mining town of Wallace. The driver and her fellow passengers had been killed outright, but Katherine had been dragged away by 3 men with cold eyes and colder hearts. When she tried to escape during the night, they'd beaten her, taken her boots and water, and left her miles from anywhere, laughing as they rode off. "Ain't nobody common for you, city girl," the leader had sneered. "Desert'll take care of what's left." Katherine had no family waiting for her, no one who would sound the alarm when she didn't arrive at her destination. Her parents had died of influenza the previous winter, leaving her with nothing but debts and a teaching position offer in Wallace, Arizona territory, a place she'd never even heard of until the letter had arrived. Now, as the sun climbed higher, Katherine felt the last of her strength ebbing away. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees on the scorching ground. The distant shape of a mesa wavered in the heat shimmer, seeming to mock her with the false promise of shelter. With a whimper, she slumped forward, her cheek pressing against the hot earth. "I suppose this is where my story ends," she whispered, her voice little more than a rasp. Then came the sound so faint at first she thought it was merely her imagination. The rhythmic thudding of hooves against packed earth. Katherine tried to raise her head but found she lacked the strength even for that small movement. The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed, and finally stopped altogether. "Sweet Jesus," a deep voice murmured from somewhere above her. "What in tarnation?" The sun's brutal glare was suddenly blocked, and Katherine felt the blessed relief of shade falling across her face. With tremendous effort, she forced her eyes open, blinking against the dust and brightness. A tall figure loomed over her, the sun behind him creating a halo effect that made it impossible to discern his features. "Madam, can you hear me?" The voice was gentle but urgent, with the slight drawl of someone who'd spent his life in the Western Territories. "Water," Katherine croaked, the single word nearly impossible to form with her parched mouth. The figure knelt beside her, and strong hands carefully turned her over. A canteen was pressed to her lips, and Katherine gulped desperately at the lukewarm liquid that tasted sweeter than any wine she'd ever sampled. "Easy now," the voice cautioned, pulling the canteen away slightly. "Too much at once will make you sick. Small sips." As her vision began to clear, Katherine could finally see her rescuer. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. A well-worn Stetson sat atop dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. His clothing, denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and dust-covered boots marked him unmistakably as a cowboy. "What's your name, madam?" he asked, supporting her head with one large, calloused hand. "Katherine," she managed after another careful sip of water. "Katherine Turner." "I'm Ethan Xavier," he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon with the wariness of a man who knew the dangers of the territory all too well. "What happened to you? Where are your shoes?" Katherine tried to explain, but her words came out jumbled and disconnected. Ethan nodded as if he understood anyway. "Whoever left you out here like this meant for you to die," he said grimly. "The sun'll kill a person faster than just about anything in these parts." He looked down at her with surprising gentleness. "But not while I have shade to give, Miss Turner." Before Katherine could respond, Ethan was already moving with efficient purpose. He shrugged out of his leather vest and draped it over her head and shoulders to shield her from the sun. Then, with care that belied his rugged appearance, he lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "My horse is just over that rise," he told her, nodding toward a slight elevation in the otherwise flat terrain. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles southeast of here. Not much to look at, but there's clean water and a doctor in town who can tend to you proper." Katherine wanted to thank him, to ask more questions, but exhaustion claimed her once more. The last thing she remembered was being lifted onto the back of a chestnut mare, Ethan's strong arms securing her as darkness mercifully closed in. When Katherine next opened her eyes, she found herself in an unfamiliar bedroom. Soft cotton sheets covered her, and a patchwork quilt had been pulled up to her chest. The room was simple, but clean. A pine dresser stood against one wall, a washstand with basin and pitcher in the corner, and curtains that appeared to have been fashioned from flour sacks fluttered in the breeze from the open window. She tried to sit up but fell back with a groan as pain lanced through her head and every muscle protested the movement. The sound must have carried, for within moments the door opened, and a round-faced older woman with salt and pepper hair hurried in. "Oh, good, you're awake," she said briskly, moving to Katherine's bedside. "I was beginning to worry. I'm Martha Wilson, by the way. Ethan brought you to my boarding house in Wallace." "How long have I been here?" Katherine asked, her voice still rough but stronger than before. "2 days," Martha answered, helping Katherine sit up slightly and plumping the pillows behind her. "Dr. Bailey's been by twice. Said you were suffering from heatstroke and dehydration, not to mention those nasty bruises. You've been drifting in and out of consciousness." Katherine's hand went instinctively to her face, feeling the tender spots where the bandits had struck her. "The bruises will fade," Martha assured her, pouring water from the pitcher into a glass. "Though I'd like to get my hands on the bastards, pardon my language, who did this to you." Katherine sipped the water gratefully. "Where is Mr. Xavier? I need to thank him." "Ethan went back out to his ranch after bringing you here, but he's been in town twice to check on you," Martha replied with a knowing smile that Katherine couldn't quite interpret. "He said to send word when you woke up. He'll be glad to know you're on the mend." Over the next few days, Katherine regained her strength under Martha's attentive care. She learned that the kind boarding house owner was a widow who had come west with her husband 20 years earlier during the first silver boom. When he died in a mining accident, Martha had converted their home into a boarding house to support herself. Katherine also discovered that her trunk, which had been on the stage coach, had been recovered by the local sheriff and brought to the boarding house. While the bandits had stolen any valuables, her clothes and teaching materials remained intact. On the 4th day, as Katherine sat in a rocking chair on the boarding house porch taking in the dusty main street of Wallace, she spotted a familiar figure riding toward the house. Ethan Xavier dismounted with fluid grace, tethered his horse to the hitching post, and removed his hat as he approached. "Miss Turner," he said with a slight nod, "you're looking considerably better than when I found you." Katherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Despite her still healing injuries, she'd taken care with her appearance that morning, wearing one of her simpler dresses with her hair neatly pinned. "Thanks to you, Mr. Xavier," she replied. "I owe you my life." Ethan shook his head, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Perhaps," Katherine said, "but it was you who found me, and I am eternally grateful." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them before Ethan cleared his throat. "Sheriff McCoy would like to speak with you when you're feeling up to it. See if you can identify the men who attacked you." Katherine nodded, steeling herself against the memory. "Of course, I'll go to his office tomorrow." "I can escort you there if you'd like," Ethan offered, turning his hat in his hands. "Town's mostly decent folk, but after what happened—" "I would appreciate that very much," Katherine said sincerely. Ethan nodded again, seemingly uncertain what else to say. "Well, I should be getting back to the ranch. Got cattle that won't feed themselves." As he turned to leave, Katherine impulsively reached out and caught his arm. "Mr. Xavier, Ethan, would you join me for dinner tomorrow evening, here at the boarding house? It's the least I can do to thank you." Surprise flashed across his face, followed by something that might have been pleasure. "I'd be honored, Miss Turner." "Katherine," she corrected with a small smile. "Katherine," he repeated, and the way he said her name sent an unexpected warmth through her. With a tip of his hat, Ethan mounted his horse and rode off down the street. Martha, who had observed the exchange from the doorway, emerged onto the porch with a knowing smile. "That man has ridden into town every day to check on you," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside Katherine's. "And Ethan Xavier isn't exactly known for socializing." "What can you tell me about him?" Katherine asked, her eyes still following Ethan's retreating figure. "Came to Arizona Territory about 5 years ago, bought a small spread southeast of town, keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings and quick to help a neighbor in need." Martha paused, studying Katherine's face. "Lost his wife and young daughter to fever back in Texas, from what I hear, though he never speaks of it." Katherine felt a pang of sympathy. "That explains the sadness in his eyes." "You noticed that, did you?" Martha said with raised eyebrows. "Well, it's been a long time since Ethan Xavier showed interest in any woman's company. You must have made quite an impression." "Don't be ridiculous," Katherine protested, feeling her cheeks warm again. "He's simply being kind to someone in distress." "If you say so, dear," Martha replied, but the skepticism in her tone was unmistakable. The following morning, Katherine prepared herself for the visit to the sheriff's office. She dressed in her most practical outfit, a navy blue skirt and white shirt-waist that lent her a professional appearance. When Ethan arrived to escort her, he had clearly made an effort as well. His clothes, while still those of a working man, were clean, and he'd trimmed his stubble to a neat beard. "You look well," he commented as they walked side by side down the main street of Wallace. "Thank you," Katherine replied. "I feel almost myself again, though I find I'm still tiring easily." "That's to be expected. The desert takes a lot out of a person, even those of us used to it." As they walked, Katherine observed the town more carefully than she had been able to from the boarding house porch. Wallace was a typical Western settlement, a wide main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a mix of wooden structures, and a few more substantial ones built of the local stone. The Silver Strike Saloon dominated one corner, while the Miners' Bank occupied another. A general store, a Sayer's office, livery stable, and a small church completed the picture, along with various smaller businesses. "It's smaller than I expected," Katherine admitted. "Wallace has seen better days," Ethan explained. "When the first silver vein played out, a lot of folks moved on. There's still enough mining to keep the town going, and the ranches in the area ship cattle east, but it's not exactly thriving." "And yet they advertised for a schoolteacher," Katherine mused. Ethan glanced at her. "That's why you were coming here, to teach," Katherine nodded. "I received an offer from the town council. They're converting an old storefront into a schoolhouse. The families that stayed after the bust have been pushing for proper schooling," Ethan said. "Been sending their kids to Mrs. Peterson's front parlor for lessons, but she's getting on in years." They reached the sheriff's office, a sturdy stone building with barred windows. Inside, Sheriff McCoy, a weathered man with a silver mustache and shrewd eyes, listened intently as Katherine recounted her ordeal, occasionally making notes. "Did any of them call each other by name?" he asked when she'd finished. Katherine thought carefully. "The leader. I believe the others called him Reeves or Reeve. One had a scar across his left cheek from here to here." She traced a line from her cheekbone to her jaw. "The third was younger, maybe 20, with red hair." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Sounds like Luke Reeves and his boys. They've been causing trouble all over the territory. I'll wire the descriptions to the other sheriffs in the area." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "If they're caught, would you be willing to testify against them?" Katherine straightened her spine. "Absolutely." After leaving the sheriff's office, Ethan suggested they stop at the general store. "You'll be needing supplies if you're staying in Wallace," he explained. "Actually, I'm not entirely sure I am staying," Katherine admitted as they walked. "After what happened." Ethan stopped and turned to face her. "You can't let men like that chase you away from living your life, Katherine. This town needs a proper teacher." The conviction in his voice surprised her. "You seem very certain about that." A shadow passed over his face. "Education matters. Especially out here where it's too easy to grow up knowing nothing but hard work and harder living." After a moment's hesitation, he added, "My daughter would have started school this year." The simple statement, delivered without emotion, struck Katherine deeply. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Ethan acknowledged her words with a nod, then continued walking. "Besides," he added in a lighter tone, "if you leave, I'll have gotten all cleaned up for our dinner tonight for nothing." Despite everything, Katherine found herself smiling. "We couldn't have that, could we?" That evening, Katherine took extra care with her appearance, choosing a sage green dress that complemented her eyes and arranging her light brown hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. When Martha commented on her efforts, Katherine insisted it was simply because this was her first proper meal in company since her ordeal. Ethan arrived promptly at 6, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt with an actual string tie. He'd even polished his boots. When Katherine descended the stairs, she was gratified to see his eyes widen slightly before he quickly composed his features. Martha had prepared a special meal for them in the private dining room reserved for boarders, though Katherine noticed the other residents had mysteriously found reasons to eat elsewhere that evening. The table was set with Martha's best china, and a small vase of wildflowers served as a centerpiece. "This is very kind of Mrs. Wilson," Ethan remarked as they sat down. "She seems determined to see me settled in Wallace," Katherine replied with a wry smile. "I believe she's taken my welfare as a personal project." "Martha Wilson has a habit of collecting strays," Ethan said, his lips quirking upward. "Did it with me when I first arrived, practically forced home-cooked meals on me for months." "And now you've brought her another stray," Katherine observed. "A far prettier one than she's used to," Ethan said, then immediately looked embarrassed by his own boldness. The dinner passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Katherine had anticipated. Ethan, while clearly unaccustomed to social niceties, proved to be thoughtful and well-spoken. He told her about his ranch, the challenges of raising cattle in the harsh Arizona climate, and his hopes to expand his modest herd. In turn, Katherine shared stories of her life in Pennsylvania, her parents, and her training as a teacher. She found herself talking more freely than she had in years, perhaps because Ethan listened with such genuine interest. "What made you decide to come all the way to Arizona territory?" he asked as they lingered over coffee and Martha's apple pie. Surely there were teaching positions closer to home. Katherine hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My parents' illness left me with considerable debts. The position here offered housing and a salary that would allow me to eventually pay what I owe, and..." She paused. "I wanted a fresh start, somewhere no one knew me or had expectations of me." Ethan nodded in understanding. "That's why most of us come west. To leave something behind or to find something new." "And which was it for you?" Katherine asked softly. "Both," he answered simply, and she didn't press further. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan walked Katherine to the foot of the stairs that led to her room. "Thank you for dinner," he said formally, as if suddenly aware of how comfortable they'd become with each other. "It was the most pleasant evening I've had in a long while." "For me as well," Katherine admitted. Perhaps we could do it again sometime." The smile that spread across Ethan's face transformed his features, erasing years of solitude and grief. "I'd like that very much." The following weeks established a pattern that gradually became the framework of Katherine's new life in Wallace. The converted storefront school opened on schedule. and Katherine found herself with 15 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. The work was challenging but rewarding, especially when she saw the hunger for knowledge in children who had previously had limited access to education. Twice a week, Ethan would ride into town for supplies and invariably find a reason to stop by the schoolhouse. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a jar of honey from wild bees, a particularly beautiful rock he'd found that he thought might interest her students, or wildflowers that grew near his ranch. On Sundays, he would escort her to church and afterward join her for dinner at the boarding house. Katherine quickly became part of the community, making friends with the local women and earning respect from the townspeople for her dedication to their children's education. Even so, there were whispers about her friendship with Ethan Xavier, particularly from some of the unmarried women who had previously set their caps at the handsome rancher without success. "Don't pay them any mind," Martha advised one evening as she helped Katherine mend a tear in one of her skirts. "People will always talk. Fact is, Ethan's been alone too long, and everyone with eyes can see he's sweet on you." "We're friends," Katherine insisted, though her heart quickened at Martha's words. HMPH was Martha's only response, but her expression spoke volumes. As summer gave way to fall, Katherine found herself looking forward to Ethan's visits with increasing anticipation. They had progressed to using each other's given names without hesitation, and the awkwardness of their early interactions had been replaced by an easy companionship that nonetheless held an undercurrent of something deeper. One crisp October afternoon, Ethan arrived at the schoolhouse just as Katherine was dismissing her students for the day. He waited patiently while she gathered her materials, then presented her with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, taking it carefully. "Open it and see," he replied, an unusual nervousness in his manner. Inside the box, nestled on a piece of soft cloth, was a silver brooch in the shape of a book. It was simple but beautifully crafted, with tiny engraved details that caught the light. "Ethan, it's lovely," Katherine breathed, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Had it made by Mr. Sanchez, the silversmith," he explained. "Thought it suited you. A teacher should have a book, even if it's just a silver one. Thank you." Katherine pinned it to her collar immediately, her fingers trembling slightly at the significance of the gift, the first personal item she'd received from him. "There's something else," Ethan said, his voice growing serious. "Sheriff McCoy received word this morning. They've captured Reeves and his gang in Tucson." Katherine's hand flew to her mouth. "All of them," Ethan nodded. "They tried to rob a bank there. One of them was killed in the attempt, the young red-headed one. Reeves and the scarred man are in custody. The territorial marshal will be bringing them to Wallace next week for you to identify." A mix of emotions washed over Katherine: relief that her attackers had been caught, dread at having to face them again, and lingering fear from the memory of their cruelty. Ethan must have read these feelings in her expression, for he stepped closer and tentatively took her hand. "You don't have to do this alone. I'll be right there with you." Katherine squeezed his hand gratefully. "That means more to me than I can say." True to his word, when the marshal arrived with his prisoners a week later, Ethan was at Katherine's side as she identified Luke Reeves and his accomplice. The men glared at her with undisguised hatred, but with their hands and feet shackled, they could do nothing more. "You're a brave woman, Miss Turner," the marshal commented afterward. "Your testimony will help ensure these men hang for their crimes. They've killed at least 3 other people that we know of." That evening, Katherine sat on the boarding house porch, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill, trying to process the day's events. She heard footsteps on the wooden steps and looked up to find Ethan approaching with 2 steaming cups. "Martha said you might want some hot chocolate," he said, offering one of the cups. "Said it's good for steadying nerves." "Martha seems to think you're the cure for all my troubles," Katherine replied with a wan smile, accepting the drink. Ethan settled into the chair beside hers. "Are you all right? Seeing those men again couldn't have been easy." Katherine stared into her cup for a long moment. It was difficult, but also freeing in a strange way. They can't hurt me or anyone else anymore. They sat in companionable silence as the sun set over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Finally, Katherine spoke again. "I've decided to stay in Wallace permanently," she announced. "The school board has offered me a 2-year contract, and I've accepted." Ethan turned to her, his expression betraying nothing. "What about your debts back east? I've arranged to send payments," Katherine explained. "And with the salary they're offering, plus room and board, I should be able to clear what I owe within those 2 years." "That's good news," Ethan said carefully. "For the town, I mean. The children need a teacher like you." Katherine gathered her courage. "And what about you, Ethan? Is it good news for you as well?" His eyes met hers, and the intensity she saw there made her breath catch. "You know it is." Before either could say more, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street. 3 riders were galloping into town, one of them slumped over his saddle. "Something's wrong," Ethan said, immediately alert. He set down his cup and strode toward the street, Katherine close behind him. The riders pulled up in front of the doctor's house across the way. "We need the doctor," one shouted. "Charlie's been shot." Dr. Bailey emerged from his house, quickly assessing the wounded man still on horseback. "Get him inside," he ordered, then spotted Ethan. "Xavier, give us a hand, will you?" Ethan hurried to help, and together they carried the injured man into the doctor's house. Katherine waited anxiously on the porch until Ethan returned nearly an hour later, his shirt stained with blood. "What happened?" she asked as he sank heavily into the chair beside her. "Cattle rustlers," Ethan said grimly. "Hit the Turner ranch about 10 miles north of here. Charlie's their foreman. He tried to stop them and took a bullet for his trouble." He rubbed a hand over his face. "Doctor. Bailey thinks he'll pull through, but it was close." "Thank God," Katherine murmured. "The problem is those rustlers are still out there," Ethan continued. "Sheriff's organizing a posse to go after them at first light." Katherine felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "And you're joining it." It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded anyway. "I have to. Next time it could be my cattle they come for. Besides, out here we look after our own." "I understand," Katherine said, though the thought of him riding into danger terrified her. "Just be careful." Ethan reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her skin. "I will. I have a reason to come back safe now." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, filled with promise and possibility. The following morning, Katherine watched from the boarding house steps as the posse assembled in front of the sheriff's office. Ethan, rifle strapped to his saddle and pistol at his hip, looked grim and determined as Sheriff McCoy gave final instructions to the 12 men who had volunteered. When it was time to leave, Ethan broke away from the group and rode over to where Katherine stood. Without a word, he reached down and pressed something into her hand, a small, smooth stone with veins of copper running through it. "For luck," he said simply, then rejoined the posse as they rode out of town. Katherine clutched the stone tightly, watching until the riders disappeared from view. Only then did she notice Martha standing beside her. "That man's in love with you," the older woman stated matter-of-factly. "Has been since the day he found you in the desert." "How can you be so sure?" Katherine asked, the hope she'd been harboring suddenly laid bare. "Because I have eyes in my head," Martha replied with a fond exasperation. "And because I've never seen Ethan Xavier look at anyone the way he looks at you, like your water in the desert." Katherine smiled at the apt metaphor. "That's fitting, considering how we met." The next 3 days were the longest of Katherine's life. She taught her classes, went through the motions of her daily routine, but her thoughts were constantly with Ethan and the posse. Had they found the rustlers? Were they safe? Had Ethan been injured or worse? On the afternoon of the 3rd day, just as school was ending, Katherine heard the commotion in the street. Her heart leaped into her throat as she hurried to the door, her students crowding behind her. The posse was returning, riding slowly down the main street. Sheriff McCoy led the way, followed by 3 men whose hands were bound, their horses tethered to those of their captors. Behind them came the rest of the posse, dusty and tired but mostly unharmed from what Katherine could see. And then she spotted him, Ethan, riding at the rear of the group. Relief flooded through her, so powerful it made her knees weak. But as he drew closer, she saw the makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm, stained with blood. "Class dismissed," she told her students, her voice surprisingly steady. Then, gathering her skirts, she hurried into the street. Ethan saw her coming and reined his horse to a stop, a smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "Katherine," he said, as if her name alone were a comfort. "You're hurt," she replied, reaching up toward his injured arm. "It's nothing," he assured her. "Bullet just grazed me, doctor." "Bailey can patch it up in no time." Before she could respond, Sheriff McCoy called out, "Xavier, need you to give your statement while it's fresh." Ethan nodded to the sheriff, then turned back to Katherine. "I have to go, but afterward, I'll be at the boarding house," she promised. It was nearly nightfall when Ethan finally arrived at Martha's, his arm properly bandaged and his clothes changed. Katherine had been watching from the window and met him at the door before he could knock. "Come in," she said, leading him to the parlor where a fire burned in the grate against the evening chill. Martha, with her usual tact, had made herself scarce after preparing a light supper for them. "You should be resting," Katherine chided gently as Ethan sank into an armchair. "I've been wanting to see you for 3 days," he replied. "Rest can wait." Katherine poured him a cup of coffee from the pot Martha had left warming. "Tell me what happened." Ethan took the cup gratefully. "We tracked the rustlers north into the hills. They'd split up the stolen cattle into smaller herds, thinking we wouldn't be able to follow them all. But Sheriff McCoy's a good tracker. We caught up with the main group yesterday morning, and that's when you were shot," Katherine asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Ethan nodded. "They didn't surrender peacefully. One of them tried to make a break for it, and I went after him." He shrugged his good shoulder. "Got careless, let him get a shot off. You could have been killed," Katherine said softly, "but I wasn't." Ethan set down his cup and leaned forward. "Katherine, being out there, not knowing if I'd make it back, it made some things very clear to me." Katherine's heart began to race. "What things?" "That life's too short and too uncertain to waste time being cautious," he said, his gray eyes intense. "That I've been alone too long. That meeting you was the best thing that's happened to me since." He trailed off, then took a deep breath. "Since I lost my family," Katherine moved from her chair to kneel beside his, taking his hand in both of hers. "Ethan, I know it hasn't been that long since we met," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if he feared losing his courage. "And maybe it's too soon to say this, but I'm in love with you, Katherine Turner. Have been since I found you in that desert, and probably would have figured it out eventually even if those rustlers hadn't made me face my own mortality." Tears sprang to Katherine's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "I love you too, Ethan. I think I started falling for you the moment you said you wouldn't let me die while you had shade to give." Ethan reached out with his good arm and gently cupped her cheek. "I want to give you more than shade, Katherine. I want to give you a home, a family, a life together, if you'll have me." In answer, Katherine leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tender at first, then deepened as Ethan pulled her closer, his hand tangling in her hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "I'll take that as a yes," Ethan said with a smile that lit his entire face. "It's a definite yes," Katherine confirmed, her own smile matching his. The wedding took place in December, after the fall roundup was complete, and Ethan had time to make improvements to the ranch house. The entire town of Wallace turned out for the ceremony in the small church, followed by a celebration at the Silver Strike Saloon that lasted well into the night. Martha Wilson cried openly during the ceremony and later claimed credit for the match. "Knew it from the moment he carried her into my boarding house," she told anyone who would listen. "Two lost souls finding each other, it's God's work, plain and simple." Sheriff McCoy, somewhat mellowed by the whiskey flowing freely at the reception, clapped Ethan on his now healed shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd settle down again, Xavier. That woman must be something special." "The most special," Ethan agreed, his eyes never leaving Katherine as she moved among the guests in her simple white dress, a crown of winter berries in her hair. Luke Reeves and his accomplice had been tried and sentenced to hang for their crimes, including the attack on Katherine. Though she had testified at their trial with unwavering composure, Katherine had declined to attend the execution. "I don't need to see them die to know justice has been done," she had told Ethan. "I'd rather focus on living," and live they did. Katherine continued teaching in the Wallace school, riding to town each morning on a gentle mare Ethan had trained especially for her. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset and talking about their days, their plans, their dreams. Spring brought new calves to the ranch and news that made their happiness complete. Katherine was expecting a child of her own. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked one evening as they sat together, his hand resting protectively on the slight swell of her abdomen. Katherine covered his hand with hers. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered honestly. "When those men left me to die in the desert, I thought my life was over." "I never dreamed it was just beginning." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best ones." "And sometimes," Katherine added, turning to meet his lips with hers, "a little shade is all it takes to save a life." Their son was born the following November, a healthy, robust boy with his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's determined spirit. They named him Samuel, after Ethan's father, and from his earliest days he thrived in the love that surrounded him. As the years passed, the Xavier Ranch prospered. Ethan's careful management and hard work expanded his holdings and his herd. Katherine continued teaching until their second child, a daughter named Sarah, was born 3 years after Samuel. Then she focused on raising their children and creating educational materials for the growing number of remote ranching families in the area. The terrible events that had brought them together faded into memory, though neither ever forgot the lessons learned from that time. That life was precious, that courage came in many forms, and that love could indeed bloom in the harshest of circumstances. In the summer of 1888, 10 years after Ethan had found Katherine dying in the desert, they hosted a party at the ranch to celebrate their anniversary. Friends from Wallace and neighboring ranches gathered under cottonwood trees strung with lanterns, sharing food and stories as the children played nearby. Katherine, now 32 and more confident than the frightened young woman who had stumbled across the Arizona desert, stood beside her husband watching Samuel, now 9, teaching his 6-year-old sister how to lasso a fence post. "He has your patience," Ethan observed, slipping an arm around her waist. "And your stubbornness," Katherine countered with a smile. "Sarah missed that post 5 times, but he won't let her give up." Ethan chuckled, then grew more serious. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been riding in that part of the range that day?" Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "Sometimes, but I prefer to be grateful that you were. Providence," Ethan said simply. Martha Wilson, now silver-haired but still spry, approached them with glasses of lemonade. "You two are looking mighty pleased with yourselves," she observed. "As well you should. Finest family in the territory, if you ask me." "High praise coming from you, Martha," Ethan said, accepting the lemonade with a grin. "Just telling the truth," she replied. "Though I still take credit for getting you together," Katherine laughed, "and we're happy to give it to you." As Martha moved on to other guests, Ethan pulled Katherine slightly away from the gathering. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small velvet pouch and emptied its contents into her palm. It was the copper-veined stone he had given her the day he rode out with the posse, now set in a silver pendant on a delicate chain. "You kept it all this time?" Katherine asked, touched by the gesture. "Of course I did," Ethan replied, fastening the necklace around her neck. It brought me luck, didn't it? Brought me back to you. Katherine touched the pendant where it rested against her skin. It's perfect, thank you. Thank you, Ethan countered, his arms encircling her waist, for giving me a second chance at happiness when I thought that part of my life was over. Katherine stood on tiptoe to kiss him, still feeling the same thrill as the first time. It seems we saved each other. That we did, Ethan agreed, and I plan to keep right on doing it for at least another 50 years. Only 50, Katherine teased. Well, we might need to renegotiate after that, he replied with a grin that made him look as young as the day they'd met. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, their guests gathered for the evening's highlight, a proper dance on the wooden platform Ethan and his ranch hands had constructed for the occasion. A fiddler and guitar player from town provided the music, and couples young and old took to the floor. Ethan extended his hand to Katherine with a formal bow that made her laugh. Mrs. Xavier, may I have this dance? You may indeed, Mr. Xavier, she replied, placing her hand in his. As they moved together to the music, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the brink of death in the merciless desert to a life filled with love, family, and purpose, it was a path neither could have imagined when they first met. The desert could take life as quickly as it gave it, harsh and unforgiving in its demands. But it had also given her Ethan, a man who had offered shade when she needed it most, and who continued to shelter her with his love every day since. That night, after the guests had departed and their children were asleep, Katherine and Ethan sat on their porch as they had countless times before, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. I was thinking, Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence, about expanding the house next spring, adding a proper study for you and maybe another bedroom. Katherine raised an eyebrow. Another bedroom? Are you planning something I should know about? Ethan laughed softly, not specifically. But Samuel's growing like a weed, and soon he'll want his own space. And who knows, maybe we're not done adding to our family. I'd like that, Katherine admitted. This house has always felt like it could hold more love. That's because of you, Ethan said, taking her hand. You've filled it with so much already. In the years that followed, their family did indeed grow. A third child, another boy they named Michael, arrived 2 years later, completing their family. The Xavier Ranch became known throughout the territory, not only for its fine cattle, but for the warmth of its hospitality and the strength of the family that called it home. Samuel eventually took over the ranch operations, allowing Ethan to ease into a well-earned semi-retirement. Sarah, inheriting her mother's love of education, became a teacher herself, taking over the Wallace school when the previous teacher retired. Michael, the youngest, surprised everyone by studying law and returning to serve as Wallace's first resident attorney, helping to bring order and justice to a community that had given his parents so much. Through it all, Katherine and Ethan remained the heart of the family, their love for each other deepening with each passing year. The trials that had marked the beginning of their journey together had long since faded, but the lessons remained that courage could overcome fear, that kindness could triumph over cruelty, and that even in the harshest desert, love could bloom if given just a little shade. And in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of them watching another Arizona sunset from their porch, they would still sometimes speak of that fateful day when a half-dead schoolteacher and a lonely cowboy found each other in the vast emptiness of the desert, changing both their lives forever. Do you regret any of it? Ethan asked once as they celebrated their 30th anniversary. Coming west, all the hardships, Katherine, her hair now streaked with silver but her eyes still bright, shook her head. Not for a moment. Every step, even the painful ones, led me to you. Ethan, lines of experience etched into his face but still handsome in his wife's eyes, squeezed her hand gently. To think I almost didn't ride that way that day. But you did, Katherine reminded him, and you stopped. And you said, Not while I have shade to give, they finished together, the words as meaningful now as they had been all those years ago. And that was the legacy they built together, a shelter from life's harshest elements, a place where love could grow and flourish, season after season, year after year. Not just for themselves, but for their children, their grandchildren, and all who were fortunate enough to find themselves in the shade of the life they had created from the most unlikely of beginnings.